20 years ago, on the morning of August 29th, Hurricane Katrina made its final landfall. Katrina would go on to become America's most costly hurricane, a title it still holds today. At the time, Katrina caused over $125 billion in damage, which equates to about $200 billion today. There were over 1,800 fatalities, and countless families, countless lives disrupted by Katrina's impact. I'm research meteorologist Ian Jumanco from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and also research faculty associate at the National Wind Institute at Texas Tech University. 20 years ago, as Katrina made landfall, the Texas Tech Hurricane Research Team was there. Join myself, Dr. John Schroeder, the director of the National Wind Institute, research professor Dr. Brian Hirth, and research scientist Natalie Trout as we take a look back at 20 years since Hurricane Katrina and tell our very small piece of the story through our eyes as we experience that event. We also, as we head into the 27th season of hurricane landfall operations, look back at where the program began in 1998 and where it is today in 2025. So we hope you enjoy listening to a little bit of our Katrina story as we take a look back 20 years later.
Welcome to a special look back 20 years later at Hurricane Katrina from the lens of the Texas Tech Hurricane Research Team. I'm Ian Jumanco, research meteorologist at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, but was also a member of the Hurricane Katrina deployment team. We're here joined by probably the godfather of hurricane at landfall research, Dr. John Schroeder, Senior Director of the National Wind Institute, a research professor at NWI, Dr. Brian Hirth, who is also on the team, as well as a newbie to this world, Natalie Trout, who's a research scientist and media coordinator for the National Wind Institute. Natalie, you've been on some of the more recent deployments, but we're going to talk a little bit right here off the bat. We've been doing this work for 27 years now, so I know you've worked up some statistics for us. So just tell us a little bit about, where has the program been? Where has it gone? How many storms have the program deployed on? Some of those fun facts for us.
Yeah, so starting in 1998 with Hurricane Bonnie, TTUHRT has been on 41 storms up through the 2024 season, with 23 of them being with our old towers and then 18 of them being with our sticknet platforms that we use nowadays. With that, we actually have a rough estimate of how many deployments that actually means over this entire time, with 566 deployments since 1998 all across the United States, from Texas all the way up to the state of New York. And that's kind of where we've been and all of our history.
That's pretty amazing. We're into the 27th year of hurricane landfall work. So John, we're going to talk a little bit about Katrina here in a minute, but this started in 1998. What was really the driving force behind taking instruments, bringing them to hurricanes? What back in 1998 really made you guys decide to head down this road that obviously 27 years later amassed huge quantities of data, all these milestones along the way? What was really the driving force there?
I think it was the recognition from the wind engineering community and the meteorology community that we just simply did not have many measurements where it mattered. And where it matters most is where it impacts society. And so we had these storms making landfall. And when they're out over the ocean, we had aircraft reconnaissance that was providing at least some data. But when they made landfall, most of the observational systems that are at the surface would fail. Sometimes they would outright fail, but a lot of cases they just would fail from power going out. And so that led to a real dearth of data right where it mattered. And this was, identified by the various scientific communities. And because of that, we tried to build mobile systems to basically go fill that void.
So, 27 years later, which is sort of incredible to think about, we still have this problem of observational systems failing just simply due to power and data outages, right? Like we still run into this today.
Exactly. I mean, in some ways, the landscape has changed a little bit because we have additional measurement systems on land, like mesonets have become more popular, and some private companies put out measurement systems as well. And then offshore, we have things like the step frequency microwave radiometer, which gives us information from right down near the surface offshore. But the reality is in most places, we face some of the same things that we faced 27 years ago. And there's still a dearth of data, and it's still difficult to define that surface level wind speeds that impact you, me, and everybody else.
All right, so all the way back 1998, it was Bonnie, if I'm not mistaken, the very first one. What was that actually like, going and doing the very first one?
Well, it's kind of tricky. In 98, we actually deployed on Tropical Storm Charlie on the Texas coastline first. Bonnie had already formed way out in the Atlantic. And when we finished Charlie, we quickly headed to North Carolina to deploy on Bonnie. And so that was our first cross-country sort of deployment. It was the first hurricane, wasn't a tropical storm, it was a hurricane. And so, we were starting to get into this. I mean, we were driving in when everyone was driving out, and we were looking for a place to deploy this big tower in the middle of the night. And that's what we did. We deployed it in the middle of the night in Hurricane Bonnie. And then we retreated to a hotel not very far away. And that was the first time I went through the eye of a hurricane and experienced those things. And, we went back, picked up the tower after the event and surveyed around the surrounding area and took off for home again. And I think we learned a whole lot about not necessarily hurricanes in the first one, but maybe we started to learn how to do it right, how to do it safely. And we did a whole lot of that over the years in terms of, building the right logistics to make sure the team stays safe and do it right.
Yeah, I think that's, there's that whole learning aspect of figuring out how to actually go do it. And this is one thing that's always fascinated me about field work is you have this challenge of not only executing your experimental plan, but you have to do it safely, and all the other factors, roads, places to deploy, sites you need, all has to sort of come together for that mission to be completed. So as we sit here tonight, we're recording this on the evening of the 27th. So if we rewind the clock back to 2005, Katrina was out in the Eastern Gulf at the time, had gone through its sort of first rapid intensification cycle as it moved off the area of South Florida. That sort of stopped. We ended up with some of the steady state major hurricane. I think 115 mile per hour was the advisory that Jack Bevan put out at, I think, 10 p.m. Before we saw the next round of rapid intensification the following day. So if we kind of take this all the way through, Katrina would go on to become our costliest natural disaster, I should say just disaster in United States history. At the time, it was a $125 billion loss event. That's $200 billion today in 2024 dollars. There is 1,833 fatalities, and it would simply become one of those benchmark storms that everyone remembers the name, remembers where they were on that day that Katrina made landfall and what we saw sort of in person unfold. I'm going to focus on sort of how our group, the Texas Tech Hurricane Research Team, how we went through that process. But first I want to start, Brian, bring you into the conversation about the tower instruments we had at the time in 2005. You and I both worked on these instruments. They are different from what you guys operate today, the larger tower systems that we had in 05. So take us through what we had at our disposal as we headed into the Katrina deployment. Mindful, we had done Emily and Dennis already in 2005 in what would be a hyperactive season.
Yeah, so back in 2005, we were relying on the innovation of John and the ruggedized trailer towers that we took to the field. So we had 2 trailer mounted towers that were 10 meters in height. One could extend a little higher than that as well, instrumented at 3 to 4 different levels. And it took about 4 people an hour to deploy the systems, but they were really rugged and really durable. And so we would take an entire team to the field to deploy, just a few assets that were super valuable. These towers could withstand extreme events, sometimes debris impacts. And so they really served us admirably for many years. And I know we'll talk about it moving forward, but Katrina sort of sparked a paradigm shift in how we went about the measurements moving forward as we transitioned from a few points of measurements in the field to really needing to document the broader wind field with more measurements. And so in a lot of ways, Katrina was a storm that sort of was a catalyst and a turning point for our program and how we went about things.
Yeah, it's a good point. So we had 5 observation systems. I know at the time we were trying to work a couple of different experiments all at the same time. One was a turbulence experiment where we wanted to put all the towers at one single place. The other was our typical landfall surveillance where we would scatter them out across the landfall area. I want to ask Natalie, because you were not with us during Hurricane Katrina, but you do this today. How has the evolution of the program really took that concept where you only had 5 towers, a really small margin for error, into today's sticknet network that is literally a mesonet you can take anywhere you want?
Yeah, it's really great because we just have that ability that we can be spread out way more with our 48 platforms. We covered the entire storm plus even a little bit extra on the outsides of it. But often, a lot of times, we also still do some experiments where we're looking at really fine scale resolutions as well. That was seen during both of our 2020 storms that we're deployed on. They also take out our radars, and we were able to look at some fine scale details within the storms, but then look at the entire storm as a whole to meet our project goals. So we still kind of have both of those flavors at the same time of looking at really small turbulence density factors, but then being able to look at things from a whole storm perspective.
Yeah, so it has certainly changed. I remember, going through that iteration when we talked about how we have to do something different really to map the entire wind field, but also to just open the door up to all sorts of new research possibilities, especially as really mobile radars became far more feasible. We think of them almost commonly today. I just finished the Ice Chip Hail project, and we had 5 of them, including a C-band that you assemble in the field. And you just think of this stuff as common. Now, at the time, right, we had the Doppler on Wheels system of the SmartR program. So there were mobile radars there, but just the combination of an adaptive network plus radars really did sort of open the door to all sorts of new research avenues. So that's kind of a look at how we've come. We'll cover this here in a little bit more detail as we kind of go through the timeline of events that happened. So 20 years ago, as we sit here on the 27th, I distinctly remember we had left Lubbock, I believe, the day before in the afternoon. So I want to bring John and Brian. Like, we had a decision to make because the forecast, if you look back at the 25th and 26th, suggested that we would be looking at potentially a Florida panhandle type of landfall scenario, not necessarily a major hurricane. And also think back that we didn't forecast, or the National Hurricane Center really did not forecast rapid intensification back in 2005. It was very rare to see a discussion that explicitly forecasted a storm to go through an RI process. So I'll start with John first, since he gets 2 votes and the rest of us always had 1. What was, if 20 years ago we had to make that decision to go or no go, already coming off of 2 deployments already in 2005?
That's a good question, Ian, and I don't remember.
So 20 years and some gray hair for some of us.
20 years and some gray hair
and no hair for
storms.
Brian. I don't either, but I do recall we did have some fairly more rigid rules than I think maybe even we realized. And I think one of the things we always did very well was to manage the money we had for field operations. I always joke now in my world today, we couldn't buy a screwdriver because that would cost us an operation day in the field. So we had to just use old tools for a long time. But, one of the rules of thumb I remember was we just couldn't spend the money to get all the way from Lubbock to, say, the Florida Peninsula or even the Florida Panhandle for anything that just might not be the storm that's going to produce the wind events that we want to measure. Talk to us a little bit about how that all kind of transpired and how you had to manage that. Because I don't actually, we never talked that much about how you really accounted for trying to get the most out of the research dollars that we had at the time.
Yeah, it was a balance, right? I mean, we didn't want to miss a major event. But obviously at the same time, we didn't really want to run to Florida for a tropical storm either. And I think people tend to think it's really simple in the sense of, hey, there's a chance, just go. But every mile down the road is money spent. Every time you deploy a system and then undeploy the system, there are chances that things are going to just break. And that's not because they're fragile, but we take them down a road. The potholes are there, and that's going to have an effect. We set them up, and that doesn't always go smooth, and that's going to have an effect. And you take them down, and hey, an anemometer gets bumped, and you break the prop or whatever. So there are negative sides of actually deploying in cases where it's not a higher end event. Another thing I've always been really cognizant of is just the toll it takes on people. And so it isn't always an easy job to do what we do. It's a long way from Lubbock, Texas to any coastline. And it's a really far distance to the East Coast or the Florida Peninsula. And, so having a team and running to Miami, for instance, getting back to Lubbock and then having to turn back around and shortly go out the door and go after something else and say Pascagoula, that takes a toll. And so we also try to be cognizant of that. And so there's all these competing factors. You don't want to miss an event because it might be the big event that you're really looking to add to the database that's not there. You don't want to miss that event. On the other hand, you don't want another Cat 1 at a great distance from home that we didn't really sample too much new, and we took a toll on the team, and we spent the dollars, and we didn't get a whole lot out of it that was new. So there's always a balance. And as the projects flowed over the years, some years we were really lean and other years we have more and we can do more and we can be more aggressive. And so it varies.
Yeah, it's something I've taken with me all these years later is that whole concept of just your work is to advance the science. And that's what you're trying to do is make some contribution, and you have to evaluate, are you going to have that opportunity or not? So coming back to Katrina, so we made the decision to go, but Brian, I'm going to test your memory because we did have the same scenario that John just talked about on the Emily deployment only a handful of weeks earlier with the We Might 1 tower. And I'm going to let you, if you do remember what actually transpired during takedown during Emily and what we had to actually do to get ready for the next set of storms that obviously would start coming at us for the rest of the 05 season.
I'm going to answer your question with the question. So was that where We Might 1, the tower got jammed sort of together? Okay, so yeah, so talking about these towers, the two We Might 1 and We Might 2, they were not the same. There were differences in how they were deployed. In general, the concept was the same. They were masts that laid down on the trailer, and we had to winch them up. And in We Might 1's case, we then had to extend basically this nested lattice to extend the tower. In We Might 2's case, if I have this right, there were sections that we had to bolt together, and then you winched the whole thing up, which was an easier design to work with in the field after the fact. But yeah, We Might 1 and Emily, when we were compressing the sections, the winch that we were using to do that, the cable got unhooked and the whole section kind of collapsed down on itself and got wedged together, and we effectively sort of temporarily damaged the tower. And so here we are bringing it back home damaged with a storm staring at us that we knew we had to get back out in the field for. So fortunately, we have some of the best technicians in the country to help us rectify the situation. And that I don't actually really quite remember. It probably involved cutting pieces apart and putting welding back together. But yeah, so yeah, I forgot about that actually.
Yeah, so I'm gonna put up the picture of We Might 1. This is deployed for Katrina in Vacherie, Louisiana. This was not the same mast. This was a brand new mast that got put on literally the week before, because that's exactly what happened. The winch hook fell, the lattice tower basically had a higher impact, it bent it, and we couldn't use the telescoping piece of it because it simply got dented, and we had to, I think the guys in the shop had to basically get out the acetylene torch and cut it to pieces, which probably made John pretty sad. But again, I think it was Jeff Livingston who did a whole slug of work, but this was done over the span of a couple of days to get us back to where at least the tower was operational. I know we were fighting battery issues too, that came along with that. I felt like we were always fighting with those marine batteries, and I feel like I have a pair of shorts that have been eaten up by battery acid still somewhere in a box in the basement from those towers. But that's a little bit of the challenges you face in the field. And so the season was transpiring. It's such that, hey, we had to figure out, we got to get at least this back to operational standpoint. And that's what happened. So back to Katrina. So we decided to pull the trigger and go. And something we often did was depart from Lubbock around lunchtime or get on the road just prior to lunch and then see how, get down the road for a way. So I think we ended up in Canton, Texas for the night on the 26th. Then the next day was really when Katrina comes off of South Florida, starts to ramp up, and the forecast starts to shift. This whole, in today's sort of meteorological world, they call it it was a big shift in track that the Hurricane Center doesn't really do very often. And it was over the span of 3 advisories. So we were headed for Diamond Head, Mississippi. And telling this story, I distinctly remember on the way in this first RI cycle, I can't remember if we were getting somebody, I think it might have been Dave Cook relaying us recon information because we didn't have cell internet in the trucks at the time. And you just hear like pressures just falling every single pass through the eye. And I'm going to ask, so Brian, as we're driving, like what was starting to go through your mind as we're like, okay, we went ahead and pulled the trigger on what we thought might have even been a marginal kind of case for us. But quickly, I think we started realizing things were starting to become much more serious.
Yeah, and I remember exactly what you're speaking of. I was teamed up with Kirsten, and I can remember listening to the NOAA weather radio. That was the information source, and they would issue through NOAA weather radio the advisory information. And yeah, every advisory or every intermediate advisory, the central pressure was falling like 5-10 millibars like in an hour, and we were like, this is incredible. And so mind you, at that point, I'm a second year's master's student. This was my 4th hurricane deployment at that point. I had no concept of storm surge other than what it was, but you start to think about, it wasn't just how strong the storm was, but also how big it was getting. There was all these factors. You were starting to comprehend the water rises that were occurring in the Gulf, all across the entire Gulf. And it was just sort of this realization of this is going to be different. And I just think as time went on, I don't know if it was adrenaline to some extent for what we were doing, but I mean, it became very obvious that we were in a situation that none of us had, first anticipated, but also had ever been in before. And then that trend, that continued on to, I'm sure you'll get to this, night before, loading up on supplies down near Bay St. Louis and seeing all the people there and just kind of understanding what the fate of the people in that region was going to be. And it was just, it all got really real, I guess. And so, yeah, I mean, it was pretty intense, I would say, leading up to the landfall in a lot of ways.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the storm surge element that I think, we look at the storms of the late 90s. These were a lot of North Carolina landfall events, a handful of Gulf Coast. But the Gulf Coast had not seen one of these just extreme surge events in some time. And I think back, my first trip was Tropical Storm Erica in 2003, and then Isabel that year. I had no earthly idea what concerns about surge. I remember we're looking at elevations, especially as relevant to where We're going to put towers. We're going to try to keep them at airports because of the exposure, and often you have plenty of elevation there, but also where we were going to stay, which we'll get to here in a bit. Some of the probably iconic photos that we took from Gaucher, Mississippi, on the morning of landfall on the 29th. John, I mean, you've been doing this for a while, and I am going to ask Natalie how you guys view the surge threat today with a very different way of going about measurements. But John, like prior to that, you guys really hadn't, I mean, you had a few cases. There was some Florida Keys attempts there. I think it was Michelle, and some of those others where you did have to account for surge a bit, but not like this, right?
Yeah, this was a different story than what we had dealt with previously. And I guess I can distinctly remember when the pressure was dropping and things were getting in the middle of the Gulf and so forth. And I was drawing parallels to Camille, not only because of the landfall location potentially, but just because of the intensity. But Katrina was just bigger, and I don't even think at the time we all fully grasped what that would mean. I knew that it was going to be bad, but I didn't really have a grasp of just how bad it was going to be and what that meant for how destructive and how widespread the surge was going to be. And so, yeah, it was even a lesson for me, who had been doing it for much longer. So,
yeah. So Natalie, today with a large number of instruments, I mean, how do you guys take a look at the storm surge threat, knowing you have an instrument that you have a lot of them? While they do cost a meaningful amount of money, they weren't the scope of a Weimite tower that from a cost scale perspective. So how do you guys take that into account these days?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really great resources that we use. There's a lot of surge and flooding forecasting maps and inundation maps that we can look at. And that's usually the biggest thing that we look at doing. I always like to say the stick net platforms don't like to swim, and they don't like to go in water when they especially have debris that's floating around inside of it. That's a lot of the times where we've lost platforms. But that's also not to say that we don't push the envelope as well. We usually try to get right up to that line where it could get questionable, but definitely looking at a lot more surge maps, understanding what the elevations are, and looking at kind of what that forecast has been, and understanding that how a slight shift in the forecast could heavily impact how that surge is looking for that area as well. But also, how are we going to get back to it? Not only could you have problems with the surge taking out the platform itself, but you can also look at roads going out, things like that, which luckily we haven't had to deal with in the past few years, but something that is always taken into account.
Yeah, so let's look. It's a good point to make. This is that forecast at 10 a.m. on the 27th, where we were looking at. I think NHC had gone ahead and forecast a major at landfall, and there was some discussion that Jack Bevan wrote in there about the potential for rapid intensification. Now, looking back at this event, come to find out, the GFDL had actually locked on to this RI scenario really early, but this is. I hesitate to say the early days of the dynamical models being able to smell out rapid intensification, because you go to conferences and people are presenting new state-of-the-art modeling work, and you're seeing pentagonal shaped eye walls, and we were just happy to simulate an eye wall. The R max was 2 times too big or way too small, and the timing was off by 12 hours or 24 hours. But in this case, the GFDL actually got it. And I think at the time, nobody really was willing to go out on a limb. And I think we knew what would come in later seasons as forecasting got better. This was one of those forecasts, I think for me, it was this one and the next one where I started to realize, I am a South Louisiana native, and this one was my first experience where personal world met science world as a new scientist. So I had family. My grandmother lived in St. Charles Parish right outside New Orleans. My aunt lived on one of the tidal lakes near Vacherie, Louisiana, on Lake des Allemands. My parents were in Baton Rouge. Another one of my aunts was in Prairieville, Louisiana. So we're all scattered in that area. And I start, calling my dad. My grandma had come up to my aunt's house in Prairieville. And And in fact, to tell a little story, we were still looking for a deployment site for We Might 1 on the sort of the west to track to cover. There was a couple of guidance solutions that still had it even further west, even closer to Morgan City. So we couldn't find airports. So I called my aunt and just see if she knew somebody who would let us put the tower on their land. And sure enough, they did. But she asked me a question that they were going to leave. They were headed to Prairieville to her sister, my other aunt's house. And she asked, she's like, am I going to have a house to come back to? And we'd seen all the surge forecasts as the day progresses. And I don't have an answer for you. What was very interesting, just fast forward, they had water come up and lost part of their deck, never got in the house on Lake des Allemands, but they moved because of that up onto basically River Road in Luling, Louisiana. Fast forward to Hurricane Ida. I happened to be with you guys on that deployment, was the first to get to their house. They had about a quarter of their shingles come off, but there was so much wind-driven rain, they had to gut their entire house and were out of it for 9 months. So if we talk about some of the reasons why we do all this work is to try to make stuff like that not happen. So that was sort of my personal story as we're going through this. And I'm talking to airport managers, trying to make sure we can get into places and things like that. So I do remember distinctly going into that Walmart in Bay St. Louis, and there were so many people that were going to stay. When you're checking out, you just heard people. I know we ran into the commanding officer of Fleet Numerical Weather at the United States Navy, which was housed at Stennis. He was going to stay. I don't know what happened to most of those people that we interacted with or their homes. We know what happened to that Walmart later. It was gone because of the surge. But so for us, we're there in Bay St. Louis, stayed in Diamond Head that night, and had picked Gaucher, which is over by Pascagoula. I don't actually remember the reasoning. I do think we were worried about being able to get back to the towers quickly, that we wanted to get outside the iron wall and be able to get back west to go get our equipment pretty quickly. Because these kind of events, I'm gonna ask John to kind of talk about what happens after landfall when we have to go get towers. What are some of the things that we have to deal with trying to get all those instruments back?
Yeah, and I think in this particular case, I was definitely not willing to take the eye wall. So I think we moved a little further away than we would normally would have at that time. So yeah, when the storm moves out, we try to get back out pretty quickly, get back to the stations and pick them up. And really we try to do that pretty quickly because it gets difficult with time when people start to come back. There's only so much gas in the region. And so you have to be ready to basically maneuver around for a good bit without being able to get gas. The power's off, obviously, so you're navigating down stoplights and so forth, down trees, down power lines. All these things are real threats when you go back. And we've had a lot of cases over the years now too, where we either from freshwater flooding or surge water across the road, we can't get back. That was mentioned before, and that's something we think about when we make the deployment. We'd much rather have two ways back than one way back to the tower, so that we have multiple options to get things back. And in that surge water, as you well know, there are all sorts of threats, whether it's animals that really aren't happy anymore, or debris, or all sorts of things. It's not a fun environment. So if you have to go into the surge water to get things back, that's also a very difficult situation. So when the storm's over, the threats are really more extreme in a lot of cases than they were beforehand. Beforehand, we really had to just, keep it on the road. It was the driving that was the threat. When you go back, there's a lot of other threats beyond that now become real, and you have to dodge and work with. And we've developed ways over the years to do that better, I think, and we do it better now than we used to. So again, it's a learning process.
Yeah, this was always the case of sort of the ability to get back to your equipment, especially when you have things that have batteries and may not, you need them to run, but you need to get there just to save that data. Even though theoretically it's always those nerves of something going wrong. And believe me, they do. Things do go wrong. So when we look at the storm itself, so we picked our deployment sites. We ended up going with, we decided to go with 3. We did a 3-tower array at the Stennis Airport, which is in Bay St. Louis, just north of I-10. In fact, if you drive on I-10 heading west and look to the right, you'll see the end of the runway there at that airport. So it is north of the coastal area past Christian, Bay St. Louis. So we went with that one with 3 towers, sort of our modified turbulence experiment, trying to understand some of these small scale features in the wind flow. We did Slidell. We actually doubled it up at the Slidell Airport, the same place where the ASOS station was. And John talked about it off the top, is the issue with ASOS stations failing simply because they run out of power and there's no data backups and things like that. So you lose all that information from those sites. And then we did Vacherie on the west side in a sugarcane field. That actually was a really good site that my aunt, of course, helped us get permission for, which was one of those unique circumstances. Well, the first time asking family for help, and that actually turned into a normal thing, because we've stayed at my folks' place. I think we stayed at my grandmother's house. We do that a lot. We stayed at one of John's friends from graduate school in Houston during Ike. This is how this all sort of comes together out in the field. Some people may think of it as, this sounds very ad hoc, and it's actually not. That's just sort of baked into your mindset of going and executing these. So deployments generally went pretty well, if I recall. I am going to tell a little story here in a bit. We always fought that these big towers had guy wires that have to be anchored by big earth screw things. And I do remember Brian and I standing on either side of the hydraulic auger at Stennis trying to get We Might 2 finished. And the first rain bands are finally starting to get it. So we're getting wet. And I think we hit a stump or I think it was a stump. I don't think it was a rock. I just couldn't get this earth screw through that. And we just start literally screaming at each other in the rain over this hydraulic auger for literally no reason, because we hit a stump or something. I don't know why. And I'm pretty sure I got the truck stuck shortly thereafter or something like that. But I want to get both Brian and John's perspective of that event as it sort of unfolded, because we were exhausted. This was an exhausting process to deploy these big towers. So Brian, to you, you did not take a swing at me, and I didn't take a swing at you either. We just stood there within like 2 feet of each other, not knowing what to do with this auger.
We are professionals. I think the situation there was the clearing that we chose was north of the runways, and it was sort of I don't know what you call it, but the landing zone, basically, that trees had been cleared out of that region so that as planes were landing, they wouldn't clip them. And so, but there was a bunch of tree trunk root debris in the ground still. And so it wasn't just that one place wasn't working, nowhere was working, because we were running into stuff everywhere trying to auger these anchors into the ground. So between frustration, of course, you've got this big tower, it's set up, you're trying to put these earth screws in the ground. It's not as though you can just, let's move 10 feet over here. You kind of got to put it where it is. And so we had to figure it out. Meanwhile, rain bands, lightning even, I believe, but definitely heavy rain. And some members of the team were not as eager to help. And so it was you and me just slugging it out, literally. And so, we're still friends today. So I think it tells you field work builds bonds, and it truly does. But
so I would second that, because I always tell people there's no greater team building experience than going on a field project. And you either love it or you absolutely despise it. There is no middle. There really isn't a middle. You either gravitate to the challenge, or it is an absolute miserable thing to do that. John, I remember you were sort of playing supervisor, just watching this all play out.
Yeah, I can vividly remember this happening. And I think I remember actually kind of laughing to myself. Maybe, you guys were yelling at each other, but yet you were still communicating and you were still trying. You were just really frustrated, and I don't think I took exception to that. And what I think what Brian said really means a lot. I mean, you were out there slugging it out. You weren't hiding in a truck, and that's the kind of attitude that we need in the field. I mean, this is a multi-dimensional effort. It takes a lot of effort. It takes physical labor. You have to be mentally tough sometimes when the weather is not your friend and you're out in the middle of it. And you have to make smart decisions too. I mean, so I think it's a true test of character. And just because you all were yelling at each other I don't remember being upset at all. I think I was kind of like, yeah, they'll figure it out. I'm just kind of laughing at it myself. And you did. You figured it out.
I'll continue along that line. So I just remember being just absolutely exhausted. I think mentally, I think some of the location that is so familiar to me, it's basically my home. Plus trying to get this done just really, zapped me. All the while this is going on, Katrina is bottoming out in the Gulf of Mexico. We're deploying towers as Katrina goes ahead and does the next RI cycle, becomes a Cat 5. You saw that radius maximum winds really grow substantially with this next eye wall replacement cycle. Pressure bottoms out. And that's about the same time that we saw the mandatory evacuation of New Orleans, which was fairly late in the game. But this all sort of changed the dynamic a little bit, literally about 24 to 18 hours prior to landfall. And we ended up dealing sort of what seems like this, trying to get our way back out of, wrapping up deployments. We were stuck in the evacuation traffic. And you can tell in this image, we took it out the front window of the truck. It's raining. The rain bands are on us by this point, and we're still seeing substantial evacuations ongoing because Katrina had just, the bottom fell out of it. And I think all of us started to get that sort of tingly, this is going to be really bad. But I think there's the how bad, I don't think any of us actually knew. So I'll leave it at that for some comments there, and start with John if you just remember this. But I remember we got in the truck and we're in traffic and I'm just exhausted. And we have now, this has become we went from serious to the truly life-threatening scenario that Katrina would become.
Yeah. I just keep going back to that day when we left Diamond Head that morning. The task was basically to get to your individual deployment site before the sun came up. And we often did that. I often used to say, and still do, that you use the daylight when you have it, because you can't buy any more. So you use the daylight that you have it. And we wanted to beat the evacuation traffic to our first deployment sites. But still, it took most of the day to deploy. And yes, you're right, that when we finished, I think there was a little bit different feeling in the air. And I guess I would remember it by just saying, I would describe it as being a little eerie almost, kind of like we were dealing with something that was way beyond what we had anticipated, at least initially, and probably than what we had experienced previously. So it was a different feeling.
I don't think I'd sort of mentally wrap my head around the concept of what a Cat 5 hurricane does, or what it is. For me, the only reference I had was, to be honest, the 1988 Nova hurricane special that covered Hurricane Gilbert, and they were on one of the P3 flights. And that was as a kid, that stuff really got me amped and into weather. But that was the only reference point I had. I'd done, we had done Ivan and Francis the year before. And I remember Ivan being like, we sort of got ourselves in the edge of the eastern eye wall in Crestview, Florida, and it was pretty punchy. And I remember lightning being in that sort of outer fringe of the eastern eye wall. Francis, lumbering big hurricane. I just wanted it to end and go away so we could go home. It was wet, long, exhausting. Brian's dissertation data would come from that event, but nothing. Like, I had no reference point. Brian, this was only your fourth. I would imagine it was the same feeling too.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I don't really recall the drive that evening after making the deployments, but I do remember when we arrived in Gaucher and the hotel that we stayed at was actually closed. They weren't taking anybody, but the woman who ran the hotel was so afraid of what was coming, that understanding that we could at least hopefully keep her informed based on our expertise and knowledge, that she let us stay in their hotel. So but that was another aspect of it, was you talk about the logistics. I mean, just finding places to stay and lining up where to go and trying to think ahead of the evacuations, because they were massive. And you think about the evacuation routes in that region, it's I-10 east and west, and we had to kind of live on I-10. So you didn't have a lot of north-south dispersion. And so that sort of kept the concentration of the complexity really close to the region that we were working in.
Yeah, Louisianians, we love to say we just go east-west on I-10 when there's a hurricane coming. We don't go up to Monroe for whatever reason. But what had happened actually the year before that sort of played some role in all of this was some of the early forecasts for Ivan was a New Orleans, Louisiana landfall. So you had a whole lot of people leave New Orleans, go to Mobile to the east. Then Mobile ends up right in the crosshairs of Ivan, and I think a lot of people are like, I'm not leaving. I'm not gonna mess with this. I'm just gonna stay put. It's just easier. Even though we did see a just absolutely massive evacuation, but we always know what transpired with the situation in New Orleans of people who simply had no means to leave. Natalie, I want to ask you a question, because you obviously the Katrina story, this is all us old folks, but you've now done some of the most notable recent events. What was your perception of the storms themselves, and sort of how did you view all that was happening as you sort of took on your first hurricane deployments and some of these recent storms that people are going to remember for another 20 years?
Yeah, so my first storm, was Hurricane Ida in 2021. For context, I grew up in the Midwest. I didn't even think I didn't know I would study hurricanes. I thought I would somehow end up studying corn or something like that. So I had no kind of perception of like what that type of destruction would look like. Um, and I moved to Lubbock in August, and 9 days later, I was packing to leave on Ida, and I left 10 days after moving to Lubbock. Hadn't even met John yet. Met you, Ian, before I'd actually met John in person. Like, so for context, I had no experience with anything. Met Brian in the parking lot as we left to go to Hurricane Ida. So, did not know what I was going to expect, didn't know how anything was going to work. So I had really no concept, and luckily when it actually came onto shore, some of the biggest amounts of damage like were bad, but they weren't kind of in the region where we were setting up our platforms, at least for StickNet 1, not where we were setting up. But I just remember even driving through, the worst damage that I saw on that trip was in Thibodaux, Louisiana. And it was just really widespread damage. And I didn't kind of think about that just because I had never really seen damage that could be that widespread. The most damage I had seen was from a tornado, and that's only, a certain little bit of area. And then, yeah, the evacuation traffic, the worst evacuation traffic I've ever had to deal with in my however many years of deploying was on that storm in Morgan City, Louisiana. So it was just an interesting experience, and then interesting to see the people and how everybody reacted. And yeah, it was definitely interesting, and especially going on further along down the line, understanding the science behind it more. It's made it just more, understanding it and understanding the beast that these storms can be is just always really interesting.
Yeah, Ida was another. It seemed like it was in this onslaught that Louisiana just took it on the chin. Ida was another tough one for me personally. Happened to be on the sticknet team that covered the Luling area, which was where my grandmother lived. My dad grew up there. I knew that town, like I knew every street, and you're driving through it, and they really did take it on the chin. And these are a lot of older structures. These were not built under modern codes. And mind you, Louisiana didn't put in their statewide building code until 2008. So coming off of the Katrina 04-05 seasons. So these are a lot of old structures, really didn't fare very well. And then tons of roof damage. And obviously once that goes, you get water in your house. And it may look fine from the outside, but unfortunately a lot of times you're out, water gets in, you're gonna be out of your home for several months. So as Katrina comes to shore, well, we go to bed and go shade the night of the 28th. First actual landfall was down near Buras. Katrina had bottomed out as a Cat 5, but then started another eyewall replacement cycle. Scientifically, something we still don't understand is the timing of eyewall cycles. Some storms can undergo these replacement cycles really quickly. I recall Hurricane Ian, right off the southwest coast of Florida, completed one right before landfall, literally within about a 12-hour window. We could look back as we were recording this it was Hurricane Aaron offshore that took a good 24 plus, almost 36 hours to complete an eyewall replacement cycle. Well, Katrina does this right at landfall, but mind you, had been a Category 5, very, very large storm, very large wind field for about 24 hours at that point. And there was just a touch of wind shear. So it's almost a bit of Goldilocks. Any little disruption in these eyewall cycles, and you start to see some structural decay. But scientifically, John, I want you to talk about, like, that doesn't mean much when we talk about storm surge.
No, I mean, the size of the storm and obviously the history of the storm, so to speak. I mean, so just because the wind starts to come down doesn't mean the surge comes down just as fast. And I mean, that was the story of Katrina in a nutshell. It was an absolute beast in the middle of the Gulf. And thank goodness we had the atmosphere, I'll say in this sense, cooperate just a little bit, because, bringing it down to a Cat 3, yeah, it didn't change the water story here, which was the main story. But the storm would have been worse if it would have been a Cat 5, and you would have added Cat 5 wind on top of the surge and further inland and so forth. So in some ways we got lucky. It doesn't look like that in the aftermath. It doesn't feel like that in the aftermath. But the wind story faded some, but the water doesn't fade that fast. And we've seen that in other storms too. Ike's a really good example of a storm that it wasn't a super high-end wind event, but at the same time, it still was a high-end surge event. And, so that goes back to the whole idea of how do you categorize a hurricane. And just because it's Category 3 and not a Category 5 doesn't mean the surge isn't going to be almost 30 feet on the beach. And that's hard sometimes to grasp.
This is something that still plagues us today, and there's been quite a lot of research trying to figure out what could be good options. And I do think there are some good ones, but there's the ingrained social science communication aspect that the Saffir-Simpson scale has been around for so long. It is literally ingrained in sort of our vernacular, to use a big word. People talk about Cat 1s, 2s, 3s, 5s, that's their entire frame of reference. And I just don't know. A lot of times you hear, we think about sometimes simple usage is gonna win the day over what's the best messaging. I think about during the pandemic, social distancing isn't actually the right word, but it caught on. We see this in other areas, other hazards like wildfire, things like that. But it's a battle we're still fighting today with how to describe the spectrum of threats that a hurricane may bring. So what is probably the most scary thing that I think just as we sit here talking, we had the worst catastrophe from a loss perspective from a hurricane in the United States history. It still is. It still sits atop that list. But the idea that it could have been worse is actually really frightening. And if you take a storm like Michael, which comparable and had the wind element, and shift that into the path of a Katrina, it actually gives you sort of goosebumps as to what this can look like. I think about the Tampa area dodging bullets. I mean, left and right for like the last 3-4 years of these kind of storms that could have put those loss numbers that we saw with Katrina down a peg, which is really frightening to think about. So we go to bed on the night of the 28th. We wake up the next morning. I say we wake up. I guess I didn't. I was so exhausted. So Storm Katrina, first landfall near Buras, gonna cut that corner across the mouth of the Mississippi, and you get the final landfall right around the mouth of the Pearl, around Pass Christian, the Diamond Head, Bay St. Louis area. As you would expect, you have maximum surge values to the immediate right of the track, but people may forget, you've also got Lake Pontchartrain and Lake Bourne there, the coastal tidal lakes of South Louisiana. So even though New Orleans ends up left of track, you have so much water. And I think Katrina did the same thing Ike did. It was so big, you had the entire Gulf of Mexico start to come up. Ike was the one we just noticed it because we were looking for it. We had water rises of a couple of feet sort of leading up to what would become a catastrophic surge. And then we're a good 40, 50 miles off to the east. We are close where we were in Gaucher, close to Pascagoula Bay. And then I'm going to put a picture up here that started to take shape right across the street from us. So this was about 8 in the morning of the 29th, as Katrina's making the final landfall near Bay St. Louis. This was our view. So John and Brian, you two were the first to sort of take note of what was starting to transpire very, very close to us. So I'm going to start with Brian, then go to John. I was so exhausted, I was actually still asleep about at this moment in time.
Well, it took a minute to register what was really happening, I think, because prior to the time of this photo being taken, you see the house across the street, of course, you see the trees behind that. But first you started to see the water back there in the trees, and we were like, what is that? And it took I guess not that long, but it seemed like a little bit to really understand what that was. And then as it kept coming and coming, we realized, holy cow, that's the surge. And we were a mile inland from the coast, basically due south of us. However, we were on the east side of Pascagoula Bay. The west side of Pascagoula Bay. And so as we learned later, the surge had sort of wrapped around to our east and actually around us to the north. So we were kind of surrounded by it. But just standing there outside of our hotel room and just watching this occur over the matter of minutes or an hour or so, as the water just came up, and it just kept coming, and it just kept coming. And we were like, surely it's going to stop. And it just didn't. And it just kept coming and coming. I mean, right then and there, all those people you talked about, we had seen the night before, the people we had interacted with, all those people you knew were in that water. You knew it. And it was, I think we all would, you were just kind of speechless at that point.
Yeah, just not that long after that, we had this. And I do want to point out, there was a family in that home. I remember, so John comes and knocks on my hotel. Actually, Brian, you were awake. I was so exhausted, I just was asleep, just trying to get some rest. And he's like, there's water across the street. And my first thought went to, this is freshwater flooding. And then you start to realize, oh no, that's the Gulf across the street. So John, what was going through your mind?
Where'd that family go? I mean, we all knew where they went. They went up into the attic, but that's the only place they could have went because the water came up to the eaves. But I mean, I don't even know. When you look at those pictures, it doesn't do the justice to the elevation change between where we were and Highway 90, which was right there, and then on the other side, how far down it went from there. So the water ended up getting right up to the trucks, if my memory was right, in the parking lot. And you're right, we were a mile inland We were just over 13 feet in elevation, if my memory's right. And we were 40, 50 miles east of the storm. It was pretty impressive. And, like I said, I don't know how many times we talked about that family. We knew there was somebody in that house. And, I still think to this day about that family.
Yeah, I remember it was Steve Latimer. We're standing there out on the hotel, and we were experiencing probably about what we estimated was Cat 1 kind of winds, gusts 80 to 90, and you could hear all the things. We're trying to keep our heads down. But I remember Steve talking about, like, is there any, like, what can we do? What can we do? And you think about there's 8 feet of water over Highway 90 that we have to cross. That's wind blown and moving. That's just not an option. Thankfully, this picture I'll put up is about the peak surge there in Gaucher. This was about maybe got a little bit higher than this. So just below roof line of that house across the street. And you can see we needed that 13 feet of elevation. I think this sort of put surge into a whole new frame of mind. And I think you started to realize what could have just happened. But I don't think we quite realized it until everything settled down. And so I remember that night being about the most eerie night I have ever in my life sat through. And I don't even recall sleeping. So to start with Brian, we were together, what was going on? It really, or what wasn't going on?
Well, I'll back up before the night. First thing that we saw as the water receded, the family, her husband came out of that house across the street. And I remember walking around the house and like throwing his hands up in the air in like complete, like just devastation, and he didn't even know where to start. And then unbelievably, he got in his car and it started. We were all like, how did that happen? But anyway, so I remember the reaction of that man. And then shortly thereafter, a pickup truck full of people, like piled in the back, with blankets and pillows, drove up to the hotel that had come from down there somewhere. And I just looking for somewhere to go. And I remember us just thinking, I don't know, at that point we were kind of like, all right, we got to focus on our job now. We knew we had to stay there for the night. But at the same time, it was real that that was one of thousands of people that were in that situation. And so, yep, we kind of hung out through the day. And then as nightfall came, of course, this was before cell phone data really. So all we really had, we had no power. So all we really had was the truck and the radio in the truck. And so we kind of just went into our pickup trucks in the parking lot and just sat there. And I remember seeing the flares from the oil refineries, wherever they were off in the distance, had fired back up, and you sort of saw this flickering in the sky in the darkness. It was the only light that there was. And we just listened to the radio as these two guys, Ian, you probably remember their names, I don't, performing the impossible task of fielding just call-ins from people around the region asking, what do you know about here? What do you know about there? And I just remember the answer always. Were they north or south of the railroad tracks? If they're south of the railroad tracks, it's probably gone. And I mean, call after call after call, you kind of get emotional thinking about it. It's like, and you just realize the magnitude of this. And this, mind you, Katrina was a 2-act play. That was Act 1. Act 2 was about to happen in New Orleans, and we weren't even aware. That was a different world from where we were. And so, the catastrophe there hadn't even really unfolded yet. And so we were, just at the beginning. And so I agree. It was very eerie and very just kind of unreal.
Yeah, I remember there was a Biloxi radio station that was still broadcasting, and then WWL out of New Orleans, which has long been sort of the voice of the Northern Gulf in these events. And it was just people calling in, and they were the only source of information all the while over in New Orleans, and like Brian said, we had no earthly idea really what was going on. And people kept talking in Mississippi about the US 90 and the railroad tracks. New Orleans, we didn't really know what was going on. I went back and looked at some of the Weather Channel coverage. And so it was about right when we were seeing our peak surge was when the first breach or overtopping occurred on the industrial canal in New Orleans. And it was almost this sense of skepticism listening to the coverage. And they were talking about it in a very almost mundane way that, we've had some reports of levee overtopping, and no one actually realized what was happening at that point in time. So over the next 4 to 5 hours, you would have obviously the Industrial Canal, the London Avenue Canal, the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, the Mr. Go that doesn't exist anymore, thankfully. All would have substantial issues, breaches, failures, et cetera, that would certainly lead to the flooding of an entire U.S. city. That I guess the only comparison really would be Harvey and the rainfall post-Harvey. But everyone knows the story of New Orleans and how vulnerable it was. And it was almost a world away, even though we were just about 70 miles away, maybe not even that, if you draw a straight line. But I am going to bring up a picture. We talked about the railroad tracks, and I've got an aerial. This is from the NOAA imaging shortly thereafter. And they were 100% right. There's the railroad tracks that everybody talked about. And you can see what surge does. You can see the debris line here. But when we think about a wind perspective, this was a newer neighborhood. And if you start to look at the asphalt shingle roofs on some of the homes that weren't touched, they did really well. And it starts to tell you this story of wind and water. And in the Katrina space, the surge became the story. Water so much more massive. And we don't design structures, especially in suburban neighborhoods, to deal with that. And this is what played out. So, John, I want to get your thoughts, going through the day on the 29th and then into that night. What were you thinking?
I don't think I have much new than what's already been said. I vividly remember sitting in the truck that evening, seeing the flares, as Brian mentioned, listening to the calls coming in. I think sometimes, we have to stay focused, and we have to do our job. But boy, you can't help but connect with the people that are there being influenced by the storm or impacted by the storm. And I think this was a really big case of that, right? I mean, you had the family across the street, you had the pickup truck and people. We had the individual the next morning after that needed the ride to the Lowe's because he was the manager, if my memory was right, and he didn't have a way to get to work, but we put him on the back of the truck and put him in the truck and got him to work so he could open Lowe's so that people could start to get supplies. And even though the front was collapsed, they still opened that day. They opened through the side, if my memory was right, and allowed people in to buy supplies. And that was the start of our pickup that next day. Was dropping him off was on the way out of Gaucher. And I can vividly then remember driving back up to I-10 and driving westbound to get to Stennis and seeing all the weird sights that we saw from where we started that morning to getting to Stennis. And there were things like, the tank that was sitting on I-10, if I remember correctly. That was a huge fuel tank that was sitting on I-10. We saw couches and wash machines up in the trees, 30 plus feet up, seemingly. We saw flooded roads everywhere, but then beyond that, you would see just abandoned cars in the middle of the road, not on the side of the road, in the middle of the road, or just weird sightings of just where people had something go wrong at the last minute and they just abandoned ship, which was probably the smart thing to do. But there were just all of these odd things. And snippets of devastation that as we, even though there wasn't a lot of wind damage, as we drove down I-10, I mean, there was some, obviously there was definitely damage, but nothing that was that memorable. But you started to get the hints real fast of the water and how far inland it was along I-10 and how high it was along like in Diamond Head. And that started to leave an impression of just, again, coupled with the radio the night before, you started to put it into perspective of just how big of an event this was.
Yeah, I remember, I think there was maybe a foot or two of water that we actually drove over through around Bay St. Louis that my mind was like, that was just freshwater flooding. Today, I don't think it was. I think it was actually remnant surge that hadn't actually just got caught. Because it had, now that I even look back 20 years later at some of the pictures, it had that distinct brackish water color that stagnant storm surge does. And yeah, so we actually were able to get all the towers pretty much picked up during the day on the 30th. And then, to be honest, we had enough gas. We had enough jerry cans in the back of the truck with diesel as before we put the external tanks, I believe, into the pickups, which is way more, a lot less effort. But we started making our way home. And I think we got, Brian and I still talk about this today. We got all the way to Shreveport. That was where we were going to spend the night. And it was the first time any of us got a look at the news. And as we mentioned, New Orleans was like a world away. And this one, I probably won't ever forget because Brian probably noticed it. I just sat there. I think we both did, right? It had to be
so we shared
30 minutes.
We shared a room, and we got in the hotel and we turned on the TV. I mean, by that point we had cell service. I remember talking to my family on the way, and they were telling things are on fire. You won't believe what you're seeing, and you heard all this anecdotal stuff. But yeah, we turned on the TV, and you and I just sat there for 20 or 30 minutes. We didn't say a word to each other. We just sat there and stared at it, and it was just like, again, there was nothing to say. And you had just left this whole region that was completely devastated, and now you had this whole new situation unfolding. And again, just the magnitude of the catastrophe across the board was just, unparalleled.
I think at that point it was pretty clear we had just played some tiny role or been a part of a major catastrophe. I don't think we would realize that it would become the most in U.S. history. Katrina is a top 5 storm in fatalities. We thought we were done with that. I think that was a rude awakening for a lot of people. We think back to fatalities in the 1900 Galveston storm, the 1938 storm in the Florida Keys, even back to Camille and Betsy, similar area. Well, we had 1,800 plus fatalities in a storm in 2005. We thought that couldn't happen, and it did. So that was one of those realizations. I have a distinct memory too. This happened about a week. So there's the entire response in New Orleans, but I was in United Supermarket in Lubbock, and actually it might have been 2 weeks later. And I'm at I don't know what we were doing. I was at the seafood counter, and Lubbock had actually taken in, has maybe 50 or so of Katrina evacuees out at Reese Air Force Base, formerly Air Force Base, where our research facilities were. And I hear this guy asking about gumbo crabs at the seafood counter in United in Lubbock. And I'm like, there ain't no way this person's from West Texas. But I might be the only person that knows what this guy is talking about gumbo crabs. So I went and introduced myself and said, man, you're just not going to find that here, but maybe get some Dungeness crabs. You can, they'll do the trick. You're making gumbo. And he's like, man, where are you from? I said, well, I'm from Baton Rouge. And he's like, I'm from New Orleans. I was like, I know. And he was with the family that was hosting him. I don't know his name, but it was one of those things that transpired after Katrina that there's all sorts of those stories. So we get back to Lubbock, the data sets. So let's get back to the science piece of this. And John, I want you to talk about the towers did what they were designed to do. Collect a complete wind record through a major hurricane, and they did just that. So I want you to talk a little bit about the data sets, and also just holistically the value of all these observations that now we made, heading into the 27th season of doing this.
Yeah, I think in Katrina, there was, of course, we had the 5 different observations, but we had several of them, 3 of them at Stennis. And this was the beginning of the realization that we needed to change. Katrina made landfall. We had done our job. We'd done it. Towers performed admirably, clean data sets. And it really set the stage for, kind of what did happen in the Bay St. Louis area. It provided a record of that, and there weren't many, there weren't many records. And, so I can distinctly remember having this conversation when we said, boy, we did our job, but there still isn't that much data. And when you talk about trying to really define the entire wind field, we realized that, well, we did our job, but there's a lot of unknowns, even in this wind field yet. There's a lot of unknowns. And it was the turning point for us from a hurricane perspective. It was the turning point to say, we've got to get more observations in these storms. We've got to get more measurement systems in these storms. And that's what StickNet, at least the hurricane side of it, that's what StickNet was born out of, was Katrina, and the realization that even though we did our job, there wasn't enough. It wasn't anywhere close to being enough. And so then we moved forward. We developed StickNet, and we developed StickNet with students. Students developed the first prototypes of StickNets. We challenged them in a class, and we took those prototypes and started to run with them and evolve them over time. And now we come to what we have today, which is 48 different platforms and 4 different trailers. And we are able to cover a lot more of the area. And it changes fundamentally what we know about these storms underneath of them and how the wind varies and how we can map that wind and make the connection between what we see in the aftermath of these storms, the damage that we see. We now have a much better idea with far more certainty of the wind that caused that damage. And that starts to close the gap between the meteorology and the engineering, which was really the whole reason we started this program in 1998, was to close that gap.
Yeah, I think of
now, are we perfect?
Some of the work that I've done at IBHS of being able to you have to have these kind of dense observations to build an objective wind field of record for these storms. And you have to have that for the forensic engineering piece to understand, why did this material perform? Why did it not? And in fact, I can tie this all the way back to our understanding of simply how asphalt shingles behave in high winds. We now know, because of this kind of information, be able to put all of this together. A typical shingle loses its wind resistance pretty substantially once you've hit 10 years, and it accelerates after that. And you can start to put probabilities on when you start seeing damage, when you start having claims, when you have water coming in. And ultimately, and I use John's line pretty much once a month about trying to make this a bump in the road. Probably repeat it to no end. Almost probably more than some of my baseball isms from back in the day. But I think that is actually the goal. So I wanted to cover 27 seasons of this. All this stuff has still tremendous value. Natalie, you get to use all this new technology. I want you to just talk a little bit about what the current fleet of StickNet is and how it really has become such a, I'd say, juggernaut of observation capabilities. I talk about it as just simply a mesonet you can take anywhere you want. I want you to talk a little bit about the current state of all the instrumentation and capabilities that the program has, 20 years after Katrina, and where we just had 5 towers.
Yeah, so currently we're like it's been said, we're sitting at 48 platforms and we have them split across 4 trailers, so 12 platforms in a trailer. From a sticknet platform relative sense itself, they're much smaller. They're just an engineering tripod. And when they're extended out, we extend it out. So the wind sensor is at 2.25 meters in height. That's kind of a standard, and then that can be extrapolated up to 10 meters, which is the WMO standard. With that, they're very high resolution within the sensor wise. We have half of the fleet that's measuring 10 times a second, and the other half of the fleet measuring once every second. And at least that's what it's outputted to. All of our stick nets also have a single battery that's included in its data acquisition enclosure that can last about 1 to 2 days. And then we have an additional battery on top of it that can make it last up to about a week. So that's kind of the state of the actual platforms itself. Then kind of within the trailers itself, one of the things that's been talked about tonight is that we sometimes go out and you can't make it all the way back to Lubbock. So you kind of need that place to be able to charge all of those platforms. And we have some awesome battery chargers within each trailer. So you can plug it in virtually anywhere. All you need is an extension cord. So kind of current state is that we have a large array of platforms that can measure very high time resolution, but can also then with these such large array, you can measure them spatially at a very high resolution. They can last up for a long time. They can transmit data in real time as well as store it and be able to give you measurements that you would not see otherwise potentially within each of these storms. I think that was what was the second question, or did I answer both of them?
No, that was pretty good. That was pretty good about the overall capability, and it's pretty impressive to see. I get a kick out of seeing all 4 trailers when I get a chance to walk through the hangar at Reese, and then it made me sad that I think the original one was parked over in the corner now because it's so beat up. It's been retired, and but it turned an idea into something that obviously became a reality that I don't think anybody really. John, you always say, like, it's the Joanne Simpson quote, you can learn a lot just by looking, and being able to make all these measurements across an entire wind field. I personally took the same concept and applied it to hail with deployable instrumentation to do the exact same thing, because it's the whole concept of being able to capture everything that's going on both in space and time. So it's pretty remarkable, and it really did strike me. 27 seasons, that's pretty incredible, the run that this has been going on, and a lot of data that has found its way all over the place. So we're going to sort of end on this note and talk about the value of this. And I'm going to go to Brian. You use some of this stuff in research. I can talk about some of my uses. Natalie, you've done this. So let's start there. We're going to just go around the horn and talk a little bit about where all of this work has gone.
I think the future of where this work is going is really trying to better define, in a continuous way, map the wind field at the surface and how it interacts with the built environment, and without any gaps, right? I mean, we want to know everywhere, every structure, what conditions were experienced to minimize the uncertainties of what has occurred. And so it's not just being able to deploy 48 platforms, that's wonderful, but now it's how do you merge it with other technologies to help paint that picture. And so, for example, our latest research thrusts involve merging the deployments of these sticknet platforms with mobile radar systems. And so now you have sort of wind maps generated by the mobile radar systems that are above the ground, say 100 meters, 200 meters. How do you map those wind maps down to the surface in an effective way so that you can paint the picture of what's occurring at the surface with actual measurements? And so the sticknet provides the ground truth for that type of effort. And so it's not just the fact that it's a tower collecting a time history at a point, it's also a very important piece of information to help calibrate new techniques of trying to generate ultimately the goal of a continuous wind field at the surface. And again, I mentioned radars, but there's also numerically using numerical models, and what can you do with artificial intelligence and machine learning coupled with models and these observations. And I think that's where the road's going. And so certainly that's where we see it going. And in the StickNet platforms and the data is so important to feed the advancements in this realm moving forward.
And Natalie, you've worked with some of this data. What's your thoughts?
That's kind of what I was gonna say. So yeah, we have all this data and we've collected it and we've looked at different kind of characteristics that tie into a lot of different fields. Looking at the wind characteristics, and we've had all these measurements, and specifically for my purposes, we have measurements from 11 different StickNet storms. So not even all of the deployments that have been made over the entire course of the StickNet era within the hurricane team. But we're able to make a lot of these generalized characteristics and statements that can be looked at across kind of an entire database. But at the same time, each hurricane is unique in itself, so you can also pull out individual things, and then hopefully at some point we can merge that together, like Brian was saying, up to other various points of measurements, various modeling, etc., and be able to take, okay, this is what's predicted, or this is what we're seeing with other types of data, and know what's happening at the surface. And so it's not just one point at an airport anymore. It's not, just 1 plus 48 points anymore. It's, we can have an entire grid, and then that can help the response efforts quicker, faster, and with kind of better knowing what's going into it.
Yeah, and I'll kind of wrap this theme up on the engineering side. Something that you guys know a little bit about. I've been sort of keeping track about what are the peak winds over land and all of these storms, really going all the way back to about 1996, and looking at that relative to how our design level in the United States is handling our design wind speeds in the hurricane-prone coastline. And we've only had, really, if you take the modern version that came out, ASCE 716, 722, we've really had 3 design level events over that period in time that the winds either hit or went past the design level for their given locations. One was Laura. Michael was another one. And then we flirted with it with Harvey. Charlie's another one in 04, depending on which code cycle you use. But you take all these landfalls and you think about probably in the trillions of dollars in damage now that has been spent or lost on sub-design level wind events. We've come a long way in mitigating structural damage, and modern codes are really, really good at it. But we have a whole boatload of damage that comes from components and cladding features like siding, shingles, windows. And some of those test standards are mired in old science. So I think all this information still can be used to create far better testing standards that represent reality. And now if you think about the statistics that we have behind all these wind measurements, to be able to slice and dice, to know what the tail is, to know what the mean is, and go replicate it in a test standard. Whether that's a big wind tunnel like IBHS or a small scale facility, or even just the pressure loading actuator systems that are basically big vacuums, you can take all this information and go create new tests. And that's something that I hope still continues to grow. And I think about some of the work we're doing at IBHS, sort of resurrecting the big tower concept, but looking at it from a wind-driven rain perspective, is we can take this same idea, put sensors on it that they're capable of understanding rain droplet sizes and how that changes in these high wind environments, and what that means for water that gets driven through our windows, through our doors, through our commercial facilities, all of that piles up in dollars lost. So this all started 1998 with the idea to just go make measurements to fill this knowledge gap that probably was bigger than maybe all of us actually realized at the time, or all the legs that this information would have. But I'm going to wrap us up, and I will let I think John deserves the final word as leading all of us for 27 seasons now from the beginning. But a bit about the why. This is my cousin Olivia following Hurricane Ida, carrying flooring out of their house. All the work we all do is to make sure that Olivia and future Olivias don't have to do this again. Someday that will happen. Probably not when we're alive, but I do think we'll get there in my optimism. So as we kind of wrap up, Katrina was, it is a storm that everyone will remember for at least another 20, 40, 60. Hopefully we'll never forget this kind of event. And to make sure what transpired, we do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen again. But as a whole, 27 years, 27 seasons of doing this. John, I'll let you kind of take us home with some final thoughts.
Well, first of all, I think what we do is for people. It all connects back to people. If you lose that connection, then you kind of lose the purpose behind what we're doing. And, I kind of boil it down. When you're out in the field after the event and you're picking up the sensors, everybody that stops by asks you one question. What was the wind? How high was the wind? They're asking the question. The meteorology is asking that same question. The engineering is asking that same question. The social sciences is asking that same question. The same answer feeds everything that happens downstream. And I think that's why we continue to do it, because we continue to extend each of the communities that we serve. We continue to extend them further and further and reduce the uncertainty of what the winds are actually doing at a certain place at a certain time within these events. And I think that's really important work. And at some point we've got to cycle it back to the people. What's the maximum 1 minute sustained wind speed anywhere within the circulation? Well, by default, that exists offshore and in one location, basically. And yet, when people live through these events, or they come back to their houses after these events, if it's a Cat 3, they think they experienced Cat 3 winds. The reality is most likely they did not. They think they might have, but they did not. And so the next time a Cat 4 comes, think, well, I lived through a Cat 3, but the reality is maybe their winds were only Cat 1 that first time. And so, yeah, there's a lot of difficulty yet in the messaging that I think as a group, as a science, as a collective effort, we need to figure out and we need to clarify. And I think we can do a better job there. We can advance that a little better. And I think that's the one thing I'd like to see as we move forward is how can we clean that up? How can we make a lot more measurements now and we nail that wind field down. But how can we start to convey that better to the public and what they're going to experience, what they have experienced, so that next time they're better equipped?
It's been just a bit of storytelling of our tiny piece of what was a catastrophic event and one many people will never forget that occurred 20 years ago. We've recorded this the evening of August 27th. Katrina at this point would have been in the Eastern Gulf, undergoing rapid intensification on its way to making landfall, eventually along the mouth of the Mississippi River and into coastal Mississippi. And we know the events that unfold as we go forward in time. So thank you for spending some time listening to our little piece of our Katrina story. And this has been a special broadcast and special recording for the Texas Tech Hurricane Research Team.